Well, hello everyone. I am Meritxell Solé from the University of Barcelona. I've been involved in the Agenda project with the Spanish team. And I will talk about redistributive effects of public education and pensions for Spain. And I will take a life cycle perspective. So the main objective here is to approximate the intergenerational redistributive effects of the pension and education expenditure programs, and considering the whole life, so taking the life cycle perspective. We all know that the social welfare systems, in those social welfare systems, working age population provide the economic resources for both the young and the elderly. And such system can be conceptualized not only, the obvious way of conceptualizing that is using taking a notion of redistribution between age groups, but also from a life cycle perspective, it can be conceptualized as an intergenerational redistribution. As a motivation, we know from Agenda results that there's a shift of public resources to the elderly, and it has been proved in many previous studies. And this analysis of intergenerational inequalities from a life cycle perspective can help to better identify which are the winners and the losers of this aging process, complementing this perspective of generation seeking for public resources. What do we know about the redistributive effects of public education and pensions? What has the literature said? We know that public education, public education expenditure has an ambiguous effect on inequality, because on the one hand, raising the average level of schooling has been traditionally seen as a mechanism for reducing wage inequalities, but on the other hand, there's evidence that proves that higher education is associated with greater wage dispersion. We have evidence for the US, for Portugal, and also for Spain. We are focusing here in Spain. And what about the pension system? Obviously, the pension system, the intergenerational redistributive effects of the pension system will depend on, but there's a huge complexity of schemes, will depend on the contributiveness and the maximum and minimum thresholds in both pensions and contribution rates. And we also know from previous studies that the degree of intergenerational redistribution is in many countries has declined over the past 2 decades. So let's see what happens for Spain. Our empirical approach will consist on a comparison of 2 scenarios. We will combine in this work microsimulation with NTA, using NTA data for public transfers. So we will compare 2 scenarios for the same cohort. We use cohorts from 1955 to born between 1955 and 1975. And one scenario is with social programs, the scenario that we have in Spain, and a counterfactual without public education and pensions. And we will perform first a descriptive analysis of income distribution, and then we will compare different cohorts and perform a inequality analysis using decomposition techniques. This methodological part is maybe the most complicated part to explain, because we are combining different methodologies. We have to do it in 3 steps. First, we elaborate the database from 1980 to 2060. We do projections. We need projections from the microsimulation model to model pensions. And in this database, we have data on wages, contribution bases, and pensions with observed and data and simulated data. Then we use education expenditure and we input it as benefit in kind from NTA data. And we obtained a life cycle adjusted income, which is it's not a standard measure, but this life cycle adjusted income is composed by labor income plus transfers, public transfers, and then we can do this inequality analysis using Gini index and decomposition. So this first database, we use an available database for Spain, which is the continuous sample of working lives, and it has information on wages and contribution basis from 1980, also pensions, education and personal characteristics, and with this data we build we use it as a starting population for the microsimulation model, and also we use it to do the estimations, econometric analysis of retirement, wage growth model, and unemployment model, and we use this information as the behavioral part of the microsimulation model. How this model briefly works? We model life cycle from birth to death. First, we assign the education level, the entry in the labor market, and we model the main events in the labor market, change in qualification groups, employment and unemployment, and we have a wage growth model, and then finally we model in more detail retirement using a behavioral model. It's a dynamic population microsimulation model that runs in continuous time. As said before, it's based on an administrative data set as a starting population. It's longitudinal. It means that it simulates each case from birth to death before the simulation of the next case begins. And it's mainly probabilistic, but we have introduced some behavioral, mainly in this unemployment and wage growth, and also obviously in the retirement model, because it's a model based on the retirement event. It creates an event queue, computes time to the next event, and once the event happens, all the times are reevaluated. It has an application with inputs and outputs. And also important here are the variables, how I constructed the variables. This life cycle adjusted income is, as said before, is composed by labor income and the net present value of pensions and education, only the public transfers. The education benefits are computed as the cost, public expenditure by educational level and court. And then we have also to model the taxes to education, which are computed as a proportion of labor taxation to education. This is an information that we take from the available data on national accounts. And finally, we will perform a decomposition. We will use a quite standard decomposition of inequalities of this life cycle income that we have defined it before. It's based on Sorox. The most important idea is that we can decompose the contribution of each source of income, and we will do it obviously for pensions, education and labor income. And also it allows to estimate an equation with characteristics and source of income and as covariates, and then the contribution of, we can easily find the contribution of each characteristic to income inequality that will depend on the share of this characteristic, this source of income, for example, relative to the whole life cycle income, and also the contribution of this coefficient. First, briefly the descriptive results. We can see here how education level of population in Spain has evolved. We can see that this education expansion have occurred parallel to this increasing in public education expenditure, which is something expected. And also interesting here is this we compute this net present values of transfers and adjusted income, and we separate it by education level. And it's interesting to see the relatively little weight of education for the lowest education levels. If we compare the weight of pension, which is very important for these low education levels, the net present value of pensions practically equals that for the lifetime wages for the less educated, and differences in net present value of pensions by education are clearly inferior to the wage differences. It seems to point to the equalizing role of pensions in the life cycle, but let's see more detail. Here we see the share of transfers to adjusted income, and it's interesting to see the relative weight of net transfers received from the education system in proportion to the life cycle income. It's interesting to see how it's higher for those at the highest education level, which is something it's not so strange, but the outcome is the opposite when individuals are grouped by adjusted work income. This is because the average income of less educated is much higher than the average of the lowest quintile. And the relative proportion of pensions to life cycle income is higher for the less educated. Here, Gini indexes. Well, it's not surprising that with public programs, inequality is reduced at each level of education, but contrary to what we have mentioned before for previous literature, inequality levels are higher among the less educated, and the distribution is lower in this group. However, this exercise has been carried out without considering a complete counterfactual scenario. I mean, we don't consider that shifting from a public system to a private system will obviously cause changes in behavior, and we have not considered that so much. Finally, this is the table of the composition. Only say that the strong correlation between pensions and contribution is mainly due to the fact that pensions represent a high proportion of total income inequality, and in the case of pensions, its share of income inequality is equal to its share of life cycle income, and the net benefits of education have an equalizing effect on the life cycle income, which is interesting. It happens for the lower and high education levels. The increasingly equalizing role played by education, because here negative values represent equalizing contribution. It has, if we see the evolution by cohort, those born it starts with those born in 1955 and it ends with those born in 1975, and we see this increasingly equalizing role of education, and this equalizing contribution of pension falls. And finally, if we perform the same similar decomposition, but not by income source but characteristics, and we do it, we take not the life cycle income but the labor income, we see that having a university degree is the variable that explains the greatest share of labor income inequality. The equalizing role of education transfers is confirmed. It means that increases in net benefits per student of public education have a positive effect on labor income inequality over the life cycle. And labor income wage differentials by sex are substantial, but their contribution in accounting for life cycle wage differentials is relatively small. And also another characteristic that we include in this regression was length of working careers, and it contributes positively to labor income inequalities. And finally, contrary to what we observe for the life cycle income, education have an equalizing role in labor income more for oldest cohorts than for more recent cohorts. So I think that's all. Only mention here that our future work, which in fact is an ongoing project, instead of performing a comparison between scenarios for Spain, we We will perform a country comparison, also based in this welfare state regime, differences by welfare state regimes. And we will introduce differences by education level, not only in life cycle income, but also in life expectancy and health and long-term care consumption. And it's in a new project which is called Weltransin with Finnish colleagues and colleagues from Austria. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We have time for questions. It's not even the end of the day. We don't have any questions. I have a question. So, when you're planning on extending this to other countries, and how do you think this will play out looking at countries that are at different levels in educational expansion? I mean, in terms of the benefits.
I don't know. I mean, if we here we focus on this inequality. I mean, the contribution to reduce inequality of public programs. I would say public programs would play the same role in many countries. The problem is that the problem or the main differences are the proportion of public resources in different welfare regimes. But I mean, the conclusions we expect are the expected. I mean, that more public resources, more equalizing effect. But no, but what is interesting to see is a different role played by education and pensions, which, I mean, less educated, for less educated, pensions play a very important role in Spain. And it's a way of comparing transfers to the young, to the younger and to the older, which is better, which is done in the NTA, with the NTA project.
Everybody wants coffee? One last question? Yes?
So it's more a question to the last slide, because I do have heard about this Weltransin, this new project. What exactly would you like to do then with the NDA data and the micro-simulation is in this new project? Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes. Yes, well, in fact, it's not me who's leading this micro-simulation, it's Martin Spilauer, not here, I think. But, well, the main idea is, well, performing this micro-simulation exercise more stylized. I mean, we can, for Spain, we have done in more detail because we had like this huge database, but we want to model these simple characteristics of different countries. We work with 4 different countries: UK, Spain, Austria, and Finland. And this using NTA data to input some of the characteristics of individuals, and then we will focus. One idea that has been mentioned before in a presentation before is if we focus on differences by education, we can observe not only differences in consumption but also in life expectancy. So the answer is who pays for longer lives, but considering these differences by education, and we have to use micro-simulation techniques to model all these things and combining this with NTA data for public transfers and different components of the model. I think it's a neat idea. Thank you.
Okay. If there's nothing else, I would like to thank all the presenters and thank everybody in this session and tell you that there should be coffee outside. Yes. All right, thank you.